Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why No One Plays. Although this is going to be another alternative episode where I talk about a champion who used to have a ubiquitous presence in the meta but has since then been relegated to just another normal champion. So today we're going to be talking about Ornn, the fire below the mountain. A lot of players saw this guy as the personification of tank meta when he came out midway through Season 7. Someone who does way too much damage, is unkillable, and more or less really easy to play. Actually no, he started out kinda weak until Riot gave him a bunch of buffs that suddenly turned him from one of the worst tanks in the game to one of the best. Even though Ornn's only been around for less than 3 years, people hated this guy because unlike Maokai who had low damage or Malphite who had no sustain, Ornn had both, and I remember so many players were going nuts about how he can build his own items and instantly thought he was OP because of it. He had to go through a myriad of balance patches and had to have his abilities reworked several times over to the point where you could reasonably consider him to be a balanced nightmare just like Azir, Ryze, and Akali. But fortunately, Ornn sits at a comfortable 50 to 51% win rate in Platinum Plus, and Riot was finally able to get him to a power level that made him not overpowered, but not pathetically weak either, whereas with the previous three, they sorta lost all hope of ever doing it for them. All the same, this resulted in him being knocked straight down from why everyone plays territory to pretty much almost why no one plays, because the only thing keeping him popular was his broken status. Unlike Rengar who experienced a more gradual decline, Ornn's descent into irrelevance, at least in solo queue, happened much more rapidly. As I mentioned before, he started out below average. He had high mana costs, long cooldowns, poor range, and underwhelming damage even for a tank. In patch 7.20, Bellow's Breath was altered to instead deal % max health damage rather than current health, which was a huge upgrade as it kept his damage consistent. His W then turned into one of the most overloaded abilities in the game. It gave him a big shield, did up to 20% of your health and damage, applied a brittle debuff to you, and gave him displacement immunity so you couldn't knock him up, kick him away, or pull him towards you. Ornn could dish out up to 36% max health damage with just a W and basic attack, all while usually shrugging off any damage he took because of the shield. That kind of percent health damage you would only see on ultimates, and this guy could do it every 8 seconds. The rest of his abilities essentially made it easy for him to apply that damage. Volcanic Rupture was a mid-range projectile that applied a slow, Searing Charge was a huge AoE knockup, and Call of the Forge God was a long-range slow then a long-range knockup. If anyone wanted to fight Ornn, they had to be prepared to take at least 3 Ws and 5 brittles, which could easily be enough to melt both squishies and beefies alike. In light of previous tanks having not the most engaging gameplay, Ornn was a shining example of how a boring class can still have multi-dimensional and cohesive gameplay. He had standard bread and butter combos, but more importantly, each ability could set up into the next. For example, you could use Q for the slow to get the full instance of W, then follow up with E for the final hit. Or he can open up with E on the wall, then use Q and W while they're knocked up. All things considered, his design was pretty cool, and there's a lot of things you can do on this guy. The problem was he was just too good at his job. He was too tanky while somehow dealing more damage than actual damage champions. To combat this, Riot performed a mini rework on him in patch 9.1, increasing his W cooldown and removing the shield on it, which made him not nearly as strong in the laning phase, but those changes they made to his passive gave him arguably the best mid-game pressure out of any tank, as he and his team would now be able to get free masterwork upgrades to their items starting level 12. Ornn could augment any 2 of his items, which would usually be either Iceborne Gauntlet, Sunfire Cape, or Abyssal Mask, so he would get free 2000 gold just by reaching level 12, that's either 7 kills or 12 minion waves. Combined with his new passive that gave him 10% bonus armor and magic resist, he had the strongest 2-item power spike of any tank, and as a result his play rate shot up all the way to almost 20%. But a few months after his meteoric rise to the top, Living Forge was hit with a nerf that was seemingly innocuous at first, just a little bit less damage on brittle procs, and his upgrades came a level later, no big deal. But remember, each of those upgrades are 1000 gold. Ornn single-handedly gave him and his team 6000 extra gold in combat stats just by existing. So pushing his mid-game power spike closer to the late game made him more vulnerable. This one single nerf tanked his win rate from 52 to 48.5%. Reason being, his overpowered passive was basically one big bandage that concealed all of the scars left behind from all of his balance changes and reworks. Ornn's primary source of appeal was that he was a tank who was legitimately able to go toe-to-toe against most DPS top laners like fighters and slayers. His combination of high base damage, amazing lane endurance, and teamfight pressure was what set him apart from other tanks. The key downside to playing a tank is that their side lane pressure is really bad in the mid to late game because they serve best in teamfights, but Ornn was capable of doing both, at least until they took it away. Again, He used to be able to do 36% max health damage with a single exchange. Because it's percent health damage, he doesn't have to worry about his pressure falling off compared to Maokai or Sion, who do mostly flat damage. Now, I understand we have Sunfire Aegis and Grasp, which sorta take care of that, but you get what I mean. Ornn was able to keep up with fighters like Darius, Renekton, and Aatrox, who normally specialize in fighting against tanks. You'll notice that tanks in the top lane are gradually decreasing in presence. Nautilus and Maokai were both staples in the top lane but have been forced into support since they can't really do anything against all the tank busting in top. Poppy used to be a consistent top laner, but now she's more of a jungler these days. Sion, Cho'Gath, and Shen are the only tanks you see in top lane now because they have high enough damage to 1v1 most champions up until the mid to late game. And while Shen's side lane pressure isn't that great, his ultimate allows him more freedom to do so since he pretty much has a built-in teleport. If you remember in my Rengar episode, I talked about how they took a lot of damage out of his Q and put it into his passive Bone Tooth Necklace and his ultimate since he can only do 2 empowered Qs now as opposed to the triple Q one-shot combo. They kinda did the same for Ornn, removing a lot of his DPS from one attack and dispersing it into others. His W lost a ton of damage with its cooldown going up to 12 seconds from 9 at max rank and went from 18% max health to 16%. This damage was then redistributed into Searing Charge, which now has higher base damage and more scaling, as well as his Brittle procs, which do significantly more damage. What this means is that Ornn's trading power was reduced, but his all-in potential was increased. Unless you were certain the enemy laner would not counterattack, you wouldn't want to use Searing Charge for a trade. And since the bulk of Ornn's damage is now in Brittle, that means there's less of it in his W and more of it in his ultimate. This was a direct nerf to Ornn. Tanks are a terrible class when it comes to all-ins. They don't have enough burst damage or stick potential to beat someone down 100 to 0. Usually, the way tanks win 1v1s is by gradually reducing their enemy's health with a few rotations of their abilities, and then, when they're low enough, you go in for the kill. Since Ornn's damage has been tailored more towards all-ins than actual trades, his effectiveness in the side lane has gone down tremendously. Oh, don't get me wrong, he still does unreasonably high damage, it's just made less accessible and not brain dead easy one-click like it used to be. The rest of his power budget has been allocated towards utility, which doesn't make up for his losses in the slightest. Like Rengar, much of Ornn's pressure has been made conditional in the sense that he has to meet a certain requirement or rely on a certain other unreliable factor besides his bread and butter. In exchange, he got a lot more utility. However, it comes far too late for it to be consistently reliable, as usually by the time they are available, you're either winning so hard that they're not necessary or too far behind for those items to make a difference. When you think of utility, you think of controllers and enchanters like Janna, Sona, Yuumi. These champions have poor early game pressure because they don't have enough levels and items to make their shields and buffs powerful enough, but they quickly become very strong after getting their core build, usually being able to contribute a lot of impact to the game by around 15 to 20 minutes. Ornn's wide area coverage and masterwork items give him and his teammates a huge advantage over their opponents in the late game. It's a permanent 5,000 gold advantage in combat stats that the enemy team will never be able to match. This is often why he's super popular in pro play because the average game time is significantly longer, and 5v5 teamfights, which Ornn excels at, make up the majority of conflict in those games. It's common for champions to reach level 16 or higher in the competitive scene, which all but assures a team will be able to dip into Ornn's immense reservoir of value. In solo queue, games are decided within the first 5 minutes, and either team will likely be spamming FF as soon as possible. Needless to say, it's quite challenging to make the most out of a champion who relies so much on a passive that is practically disabled for the first 20 minutes. But Ornn's focus on scaling conflicts with the innate weakness of his subclass. Tanks as a class naturally fall off in the late game because the scaling of damage items outpaces that of defensive items. All DPS classes have access to percent armor or magic penetration such as Black Cleaver with a 30% armor shred, Serylda's Grudge with 30% armor pen, and Void Staff with 40% magic pen. And there's also true damage, which completely ignores defensive stats. Like Cho'Gath and Sion, Ornn can reach a point where he has like 5,000 health, 300 armor, and 300 magic resist and be a giant wall of meat for his team. But League of Legends revolves so much around offense that oftentimes people will break right through him. Now, Ornn can technically carry through his teammates by augmenting their items to make them more effective, that is true. But I've been saying this over and over again for all team player champions. You can't trust anyone in solo queue. There will be times where you have a competent jungle, mid, and ADC that will make great use of their masterwork items, but you cannot rely on that to happen every time. An upgraded mythic item doesn't do very much on an 07 Vars. Continuing on, it's not just his damage that took a nosedive, but his endurance and sustainability. Tanks start off at a disadvantage because they're just as squishy as DPS classes until they pick up their first couple armor or magic resist items. To make up the difference, almost all of them come with some form of shielding or healing. Ornn is the only top lane tank to not possess a protective or regenerative ability of any kind, which further weakens his early game and worsens his consistency to reach the mid and late game. Most people immediately think of the removal of his shield on W as the culprit for his poor lane endurance, but that wasn't what sealed the deal, at least not entirely. As you know, Ornn's passive allows him to purchase items without having to recall so long as they're non-consumable, so he can't buy health potions, boards, or anything. But that didn't mean he couldn't heal. There used to be a loophole to where he could pseudo-recover his health and mana by purchasing items that gave health and mana. So when he bought a ruby crystal, he would gain 150 more HP, or if he bought a sapphire crystal, he would get 250 mana, meaning he actually could buy healing items since the very items he bought would fill him up with however much they gave. But in patch 10.13, that was taken out and Ornn retains his current health and mana until he recalls back to the fountain. This one hurt. Losing the shield was bad enough, but when Ornn lost his privilege too, that's what ruined his survivability in the early game. Even someone like Malphite, who doesn't have any sustain or regeneration in his kit, can at least consistently refresh his passive Granite Shield to make trades less painful. Same goes for Sion with his Soul Furnace. Ornn has neither shield nor heal anymore. Any damage he suffers is more or less permanent unless he goes Doran Shield and Second Wind, but any champion can build those. The loss of those aspects had to go somewhere, right? Yep, but once again, they redistributed his power budget into late game scaling. Ornn now receives 10% bonus health, armor, and magic resist from all sources, which increases by 4% every time he upgrades a mythic item into a masterwork item. So that means 30% bonus health, armor, and magic resist after using all 5 upgrades. A lot of you might look at that and think, wow, that's broken, but he doesn't get the full power until level 17. Ornn has become such a late game teamfight oriented tank, which is why he's still really popular in pro play, but also explains why his existence in solo queue has diminished. Does this mean he's unviable? No, he's still a serviceable tank and one of the better ones to play if you're inclined to do so. The end result is that they just made him far less self-sustainable, and in solo queue that metric is pretty much the only thing that matters. Now mind you, it's difficult to create a tank who can carry games, which is why most tanks are now moving into roles that can be better suited for team play, such as support or jungle. Tanks are just not that viable anymore in top lane, what with all the damage running around. I think it's a matter of circumstance more than anything. They did introduce the new anti-1v1 item, Anathema's Chains, but no one's gonna buy that item. It's hyper-specific, like you would only need it if there was a Tryndamere on the enemy team. A split push condition happens at most once every 100 games or so. Anyways, I think I rambled on long enough. Ornn's a cool guy. I think he's one of the more enjoyable tanks to play and play against in the top lane, and while I'm glad he's not the overpowered mess he was before, it's kind of a shame that tanks are caught in this catch-22 because you can't be a super strong tank because then people will complain, but if you're not strong enough, no one will play you. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated, and don't forget to sub to the channel for more content like this. Consider following me on my socials and joining my Discord server if you'd like, and lastly check out my previous Why No One Plays episodes if you have time. But thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Take care.